The sky was dark and gloomy as the battalion commander, Captain Alexei Savchenko, stood on a hill, watching the final waves of battle raging below. War left no room for pity. It had no heart and recognized no weakness. For each soldier, death was just a matter of time, and Alexei knew this well. The sounds of explosions, the groans of the wounded, and the roar of tanks echoed faintly across the field. He raised his hand, giving the command to advance. Forward. They had to break through the enemy's defenses and hold the strategically important position. With each passing minute, the number of his men dwindled. When the fighting finally subsided and the fog began to settle over the field, it became clear that victory had come at a high price. The bodies of fallen soldiers lay among the remnants of equipment, covered in dust and blood. Alexei approached one of the corpses. His heart skipped a beat for a moment as he picked up the photograph the fallen soldier had been holding. The young soldier's face looked at him, already dead, but there was something alive in his eyes, as if the soldier himself was looking at him from the other side. He put the photo back and recalled how this soldier had been wounded a few days ago. He remembered the boy smiling, asking to be left on the field, but the order had been different, to save everyone at any cost. Leave on the field. These words did not leave his thoughts. Savchenko, we need to go. Lieutenant Shevchenko's voice broke the silence. The lieutenant looked pale, his face covered in dust and blood. Alexei shrugged and gave a signal. They had to go. There were still many who remained alive, but they were no longer the same. War had changed them. They walked across the devastated field, unaware of what awaited them ahead. And beyond the horizon, on the edge of the forest, something unusual darkened, shadows moving in defiance of logic. What is that? One of the soldiers asked, but none of them could answer. For a moment, Alexei thought it was just a mirage caused by fatigue and trauma, but something inside told him it was not, that something bad was approaching. A few days later, when the battalion settled in an abandoned base nearby, the dead soldier they had buried a few days ago appeared among the living again. His face was expressionless, his eyes empty, but he walked toward them again and again, without words. Is he alive? Shevchenko asked, looking at the resurrected comrade. He is not alive, Alexei replied. It was only the beginning. The soldiers began recalling other strange events. Dead soldiers appeared at night, their bodies moving like marionettes, heading in a specific, unknown direction. But what was even more frightening, they were not aggressive. They just walked to where, according to some soldiers, there should be nothing. We need to leave this place, Alexei said during a morning briefing. Something is wrong here. Something is pressing on us. If we stay, it will consume us. But none of his subordinates were sure where to go. Their position was strategic, but something about the place felt wrong. So, when one day they woke up to find dead soldiers standing at the entrance gates, it seemed they were all already part of this terrifying game. At night, Alexei couldn't sleep. The dark surroundings seemed alive. Every sound, every creak of the old trees in the forest behind the base reminded him of the dead who were still nearby. He turned on his bed, trying to push these thoughts away, but suddenly he heard the same sound again, the crunching underfoot, quiet but persistent. He got up and quietly stepped out of the tent. The night seemed calm, but in reality, there was something unusual in the atmosphere. Alexei took a few steps to the edge of the camp, where the remnants of a forgotten warehouse stood. Nothing was visible, but the feeling of being watched did not leave him. Suddenly, his eyes stopped on a figure standing in the darkness, a few meters away from him. He glanced over. It was the same soldier they had buried. Now he stood and looked at Alexei, his eyes not shining but dead, empty. You are not alive, the commander whispered, his voice sounding faint, as if he feared this entity more than the battle itself. But the dead soldier just turned and walked, heading towards the forest. Alexei couldn't shake off the feeling that their dead comrades were not just rising from their graves, but had a purpose. Perhaps they were trying to lead them to something horrible that they did not understand. He returned to the tent, feeling the cold air seeping through the fabric. Inside, the soldiers had already begun to gather. Lieutenant Shevchenko was the first to approach. "What happened, Commander?" he asked. "The dead won't let us go," Alexei replied, feeling the weight of this insane sensation on his shoulders. "We can't stay here," said Shevchenko. "We all feel it, but where will we go?" Alexei asked, recalling the danger that might await them beyond this base. "We could try to break through to the south, to the main forces," the lieutenant replied, but there was doubt in his voice. "But they cannot find us until we resolve what happened here. The dead are moving, and we can't do anything about them. But there's something I feel inside. It's more than just a curse." Alexei felt his mind starting to lose orientation. "We need to find them, find the place they want to show us." That morning, they moved deeper into the forest, following the tracks of the dead soldiers, who left strange and endless traces in the ground. The bodies of those who hadn't completely disappeared clung to their thoughts at every step. The soldiers, feeling intense fear, were no longer sure where reality ended and the nightmare began. "It's not just a curse," Alexei said as they approached a sinister place that looked like a graveyard. "There's something more here, something alive." As soon as they crossed the boundary of this place, the ground seemed to start moving. A terrifying feeling that something was waiting engulfed each soldier. They became part of something they couldn't understand. In the mist before them, a hollow pit opened. This was not just a place. It was an abyss, a void from which low sounds emanated, as if someone was moaning in the distant depths. And there, in the darkness, something began to rise. Step by step, they approached the pit. The mist that tightly enveloped the forest seemed alive, moving. Every breath, every sound emanating from the depths of this place felt like part of something bigger, darker. Alexei looked at his soldiers, at their faces covered in sweat and dirt, and saw the same thing he felt: fear. This can't be just a grave, one of the soldiers said as their eyes met the dark abyss. Strange sounds emanated from the depths of the pit. They were hard to describe, but they resembled whining mixed with other sounds, like rustling leaves brushing against stones. It seemed as if something was trying to break free from the depths of this darkness. Alexei felt a chill waking up inside him, but he forced himself to move. There was no room for doubt anymore. The war had brought them here, and he felt that this place was part of something bigger. Now, perhaps, the answer to their questions lay right here, in this sinister place. "Everyone, stay closer together," he ordered. With each step, the darkness in front of them grew thicker, and the sounds grew louder. Suddenly, one of the soldiers, Sergeant Makarenko, stopped. His eyes widened in horror. He pointed to the ground in front of him. "What is that?" His voice trembled. Everyone looked where he was pointing. On the ground, between the shadows, drawings began to appear. At first, they were just lines resembling vague signs. Then they started to form, becoming clearer. These were ancient symbols that seemed to move, emitting a faint light in the darkness. Alexei stepped closer, and he felt something shudder inside him. The symbols on the ground were not random. They were part of an ancient ritual, part of a curse. And these drawings reflected something terrifying, something that had long been hidden and forgotten. Alexei couldn't finish the sentence. His mind was filled with many questions, but one of them was the most important. Why had their battalion ended up here? And why had they become part of this story? Meanwhile, silhouettes began to appear on the horizon. At first, they were small, but with each passing minute, they grew larger and clearer. It was them, the dead soldiers. They walked, moving one after another, like a pack of phantoms. "They're coming for us," someone among the soldiers whispered, and there was such terrible determination in their voice that even the bravest couldn't respond. Alexei felt his heart beating faster. He knew that leaving this ritual unfinished would be deadly dangerous, but at the same time, he couldn't allow his men to fall into the hands of this nightmare. "To arms!" he shouted, grabbing his rifle. But it got even worse. The dead soldiers didn't attack. They just kept approaching, again and again. Each step of their shadows was like a blow to the ground, echoing in the hearts of the living. They approached the dark pit, where it seemed the entire horrific ritual was concentrated. And then, suddenly, they realized that the dead hadn't come to take them. They had come to show them the way. The dead soldiers stopped, standing on the edge of the dark pit. Their faces were absent, only empty eye sockets staring in the direction of the living. They didn't move, but their presence was both terrifying and alluring. Alexei felt an inexplicable fear clutching his chest. This wasn't an ordinary threat. It was a spiritual pressure weighing on his consciousness, as if the earth itself was trying to claim his soul. He looked at his soldiers. Many of their faces reflected the same struggle between horror and determination. This was more than just the fear of death. They stood, watching as the dead soldiers began to move towards the pit, seemingly obeying an invisible force. The shadows seemed to dissolve into the depths, consuming each one of them. "What are they doing?" one of the soldiers whispered, unable to believe his eyes. "They're leading us," Alexei said, but he couldn't understand why they were going in this direction. It felt like a call that couldn't be ignored, a silent command forcing them forward. Suddenly the ground shook. Everyone stopped. A terrifying sound erupted from the depths of the pit, a roar mixed with a metallic screech. It sounded as if the earth itself was cracking and tearing apart. Something was emerging from the darkness, and this sound filled everything around them. "Back," Alexei ordered, and everyone began to retreat, but none could turn away from this abyss, as if an invisible force was drawing them towards it. The shadows of the dead soldiers began to take shape, becoming clear and detailed. They weren't just walking. They were moving to pass through each of the living, as if part of this place, part of this ritual. "We must close it," Alexei shouted, trying to understand what was happening. But before him opened a terrifying scene. The pit widened, and inside it, in the very depth, they saw a blazing circle with ancient symbols from which black rays emanated. In the middle of this circle, from the misty darkness, a huge figure appeared. It resembled a human, but its face was twisted and unnatural. Dark energy erupted from this entity, and its gaze was filled with incomprehensible fury. "This is not just a ritual. It's a curse, and we are a part of it," Alexei whispered quietly. And suddenly everything became clear. All these deaths, all these dead soldiers, their strange movements, their silent existence. It was just a small piece of a large puzzle. They weren't just part of the war. They had become part of an ancient ritual aimed at opening the doors between the world of the living and dark forces that existed beyond their understanding. "We can't just retreat," Lieutenant Shevchenko said, looking at Alexei with horror and determination. "We must stop this, or it will consume us all." Alexei didn't answer. His mind was filled with only one question: how to stop this ritual? How to stop this dark force that aimed to awaken something from a terrifying past? And is it possible to return after witnessing this curse? But at that moment, when it seemed that everything was lost, the dead soldiers began to move towards the dark figure in the center of the pit. They stood around it, as if following an order. And then one of the shadows addressed Alexei. "Your struggle has only just begun." The voice was hollow, almost indistinguishable, but it carried the immense weight of time and secrets. These words sounded not like a warning, but like an invitation into the darkness that awaited. Alexei stood amidst this strange scene, his consciousness struggling with what was happening around him. The words of the dead soldier's shadow echoed in his mind like a curse. "Your struggle has only just begun." He felt every cell in his body tense from the terrifying truth that loomed over them. Had they truly become part of this world, or was this just a dream, a nightmare? The dead soldiers, now standing around the dark figure, began to sing. Their singing did not resemble a human voice. It was more like a groan that echoed through the depths of time, as if the dead themselves could not understand what had happened to them. "We must go," one of the soldiers shouted, pulling his weapon towards the exit, but neither he nor the others could tear their eyes away from the dark circle that was expanding around them. It was like a magnetic field that wouldn't let them move. "They won't let us go," Alexei said, not taking his eyes off the dark figure in the center of the circle. "We can't leave. If we retreat, everything will come back again." Lieutenant Shevchenko, who was nearby, looked bewildered. He realized that they faced not just a military task, but a struggle with something much stronger than they could imagine. "What is this?" His voice trembled. "This is not just a curse. It's more, something entirely different." The dark figure in the center of the circle suddenly lifted its head and looked at them. There was nothing human in its eyes, only an emptiness that gleamed from within the darkness. "You cannot leave this," the figure said. The voice was muffled but understandable. "This has become part of you. You are part of the ritual." Alexei couldn't believe his ears. Their struggle was not just for survival. It was part of a greater force, a force that lived beyond time and space. And now this force wanted them to become part of it. "What do you want from us?" Alexei asked, his voice resolute though he felt panic inside. "Why us?" "You are chosen," the dark figure replied. "Your purpose is to open the way, to allow darkness to emerge from what has long been forgotten. You are the servants of the cursed circle." Alexei understood. This was not just a war with other countries, not just a fight against an enemy. It was something much larger, something that had become part of their combat operations without them even noticing it. Perhaps it had started many centuries ago, and they were just puppets in this terrifying game. "How can we stop it?" Shevchenko asked, unable to believe they had fallen into a trap. The dark figure raised its hands, and black smoke erupted from the depths of the earth, beginning to close their circle. "The only way is to accept your role in this world. If you cannot complete the ritual, it will destroy you." "Are you saying we must perform this ritual?" Alexei cried out in despair, unwilling to believe what he was hearing. "Not everything that seems evil to you is evil," the figure said, "and not everything you consider light will save you." Alexei looked at his soldiers. He saw their eyes fill with doubt, their minds trying to understand how to escape this trap. But perhaps they had only one path, and it was a path into darkness. "We cannot allow this curse to win," Alexei said firmly. "We must stop this ritual, no matter how hard it is." They knew they would have to pay a high price for their decision, but each of them understood. Not stopping it meant ultimately becoming part of this world, becoming shadows in eternal darkness. The dark figure did not disappear. Its presence was palpable even through the mist that slowly engulfed everything around. Alexei and his soldiers stood on the brink of choice. Either accept their fate and become part of the cursed ritual, or refuse and face consequences they could not even imagine. Time was passing, and everything became more and more terrifying. "We cannot just leave everything as it is," Alexei said, not taking his eyes off the dark figure. "They want us to accept their task, but we cannot let this darkness win." "How do we stop it?" Shevchenko asked, his face reflecting the same struggle as everyone else's. They were full of determination, but uncertainty reigned in their hearts. The dark figure remained silent. Its eyes shone as if understanding that their thoughts were now entangled, but it said nothing. In its silence, there was something cold, like death itself, waiting for an answer. "We must try to close this ritual," Alexei proclaimed loudly. "We cannot let them get everything they want." But before they could take a step forward, a powerful explosion erupted from the depths of the pit. The ground shook, and for a few seconds, they lost their orientation. When they regained their composure, something new stood before them, a huge black portal that emerged from the ground. This portal was not just dark. It emitted a coldness that made their hair stand on end. It was piercing, as if the very air was filled with evil. This is the path," Shevchenko whispered, his voice breaking. "The path to what?" Alexei asked, looking at the portal. "The path through which they can enter our world," the dark figure replied, its voice becoming clearer and closer, as if the darkness itself was becoming alive. "If you do not close it, it'll be the end for everyone." Alexei felt his heart beat faster. They stood before a choice. Either accept their role and allow darkness to break free, or try to stop it at the cost of their own lives. And all that was in his mind was one question. Did they have the strength to stop it? "We cannot let it open," Alexei said, standing firmly on his feet. "Whatever the cost, we must stop this portal." All the soldiers gathered around him. Although uncertainty was visible on their faces, they understood. If they did not do this, they would no longer be heroes. They would become part of this nightmare, and their world would be engulfed in darkness. Staying here is no longer an option, Shevchenko said, his gaze resolute. We need to act now. They approached the portal, their steps cautious and silent, like observers. And as they got closer to it, they all felt the same sensation, an unpredictable pull, as if this place itself was absorbing all the living into it. At the moment when they were ready to step into the darkness, the dark figure spoke again. You cannot leave if you cross this threshold. Its voice was almost deaf, but it echoed again and again. You will become part of us, part of this world. But Alexei did not stop. His determination was firm. This was their only chance, and he was ready for any consequences. Together, they stepped into the darkness.